A Life of Sir Henry Morgan with an account of the English settlement of the island of Jamaica 1655–1688. His family and his early life. The likely contemporary author of the Buccaneers of America circumstantially relates that Henry Morgan was the son of a rich farmer or yeoman in Wales, and that at an early age he had been kidnapped and sold, or had bound himself voluntarily as a hired servant for a term of 4 years to a planter in the island of Barbados. This statement has been accepted and repeated by many later writers. Morgan hotly repudiated it, for on the publication of the English version of that book in 1683, it was named in his actions for libel as being false and malicious. The printed apology of William Cook, its publisher, dictated or at least approved by Morgan's solicitor, declares that Morgan was a gentleman's son of good quality in the county of Monmouth, and was never a servant unto anybody in his life, unless unto his Majesty, the late King of England. The preface to the Voyages and Adventures of Captain Barth Sharp, published in London in 1684, referring to Morgan, remarked that it is sufficiently known that he was descended from an honourable family in Monmouthshire, and went at first out of England with the army commanded by General Venables for Hispaniola and Jamaica. Welsh genealogists of repute concur however in stating that he was the eldest son of Robert Morgan of Llanrymney, a small estate in Glamorganshire, near Tredegar Castle, where he was born in 1635. The year of his birth is ascertained with tolerable certainty as an affidavit made by him in Jamaica on the 21st November, 1671, definitely states his age as 36. The family of Tredegar was recognized as the head of the clan, of which the Morgans of Llanrymney were a cadet branch. In a poem, entitled Prosopia Tredegar, believed to have been written by Percy and Derby about 1661, the following lines occur: "And so Llanrymney it must bend the knee, and from Tredegar fetch their pedigree." To Henry Morgan in fact claimed rather close relationship, as in his will he made a bequest to his sister, Catherine Lloyd, to be paid into the hands of my ever honest cousin, Mr. Thomas Morgan of Tredegar. Members of his family had already earned much distinction in recent continental wars, notably Sir Thomas Morgan in command of the regiment afterwards known as the Buffs, who was governor of the fortress of Bergen Opus Zoom in 1594, and General Sir Charles Morgan, who took part in the siege of that place in 1621. Later two of Henry Morgan's uncles, Edward and Thomas Morgan, younger brothers of his father, had become soldiers of fortune under foreign flags. Both won considerable renown in Germany and Holland and eventually obtained high rank in England, having returned to engage in the Civil War on opposite sides. Edward Morgan, who figures in Dutch records as Heer van Llanrymnij, entered the Royal Army and in 1649 was given a commission as Colonel-General of the King's forces in South Wales under the Earl of Carbery. While in Germany he had married Anna Petronilla, the only sister of Johann Ernst, Freiherr von Pollnitz, governor of Lippstadt in Westphalia. When the triumph of the Parliament was seen to be complete, he fled to the Netherlands and afterwards lived in exile for several years with his brother-in-law on the family estates at Ashbach near Hamburg. After the Restoration he returned to London to seek official favour and compensation for his losses. In a memorial addressed to Mr. Secretary Bennet in 1663, he asserted that he had 40 years' experience as a soldier. 33 Thomas Morgan had fought in the wars of the Low Countries and Germany, at one time under the French flag, and at another in the army of Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar. On his return to England he took the side of the Parliament. He first commanded a regiment of foot but in 1661 was transferred to command a regiment of dragoons. He became Monk's chief subordinate in the subjugation of Scotland and gained his esteem for sound military judgment and trustworthiness. He was considered an expert in the employment of artillery and the conduct of siege operations. Having obtained the rank of Major General and second in command in Scotland, he was recalled by Cromwell to act as second in command of the expedition to Flanders, in which the little, shrill-voiced, collared man is admitted to have acted a more important part than his nominal chief. He was wounded in the siege of St. Bennet and again in the successful assault of Ypres, when he commanded all the English troops. Having once more greatly distinguished himself in the Battle of the Dunes near Dunkirk, he was knighted by Richard Cromwell in November, 1658, when he was described as being esteemed in the army next to the general, Monk, a person of the best conduct then in arms in the three nations, having been nearly 40 years and present in the greatest battles and sieges of Christendom for a great part of that time. After the Restoration he was retained in the army and, in 1663, appointed governor of the island of Jersey, then menaced with an invasion by the French. For little reliable record has been found of the youth of Henry Morgan beyond what he wrote himself in middle life, when, acting as governor of Jamaica, he stated that, "The office of Judge Admiral was not given to me for my understanding of the business better than others, nor for the profitableness thereof, for I left the schools too young to be a great proficient in that or other law for and have been more used to the pike than the book." 5 This want of education, so frankly confessed, was probably due to the disturbed state of the country, as he was born too late to take any very active part in the Civil War and was still in his 20th year when the expedition commanded by Venables sailed from Portsmouth in December, 1654. Leslie must have relied on local tradition when he wrote 50 years after Morgan's death. His father was a farmer of pretty good repute, and designed his son for the same way of life, but his inclinations were turned on another way, and finding his father positive in his resolution, bid him adieu and rambled to Bristol, where he bound himself a servant for 4 years and was transported to Barbados. There he was sold and served his master with a great deal of fidelity. 6 There may be some truth in this account, and Morgan may have enlisted in Venables' command at Barbados, as Ludlow relates that they Penn and Venables made proclamation there that whosoever would engage in the undertaking should have their freedom, whereupon about 2,000 servants listed themselves, to the great distress of the planters. 7 In Colonel Thomas Modet Ford, Speaker of the House of Assembly, Venables found a most ardent and influential supporter, who persuaded that body to offer 60 horsemen for the expedition, and give him permission to recruit by beat of drum in public places, by which much ill will was excited among the planters, some of whom did not hesitate to denounce Modet Ford as a traitor to the interests of that island. But war with Spain was always popular, as it was usually profitable, and many volunteers were enrolled in the hope of plunder, expecting to take mountains of gold. Venables reported that he had raised 3,000 men but was unable to arm more than 1,300. That Montserrat, Nevis, and 5 St. Kitts smaller bodies were recruited, numbering in all between 12 and 1,300 more, and increasing his force to 7,000 ill-trained and ill-armed men. Henry Morgan's name does not appear in the list of officers which has been preserved, and his service must have been in the ranks, but it seems likely that the nephew of Thomas Morgan would be entitled to special consideration. Owing to the misconduct of a considerable part of this hastily assembled mob, the invasion of Hispaniola failed disgracefully, and even a month after its successful landing in Jamaica an officer made the distasteful confession, "We now find by sad experience that but few of them were old soldiers, but certainly most of them were apprentices that ran from their masters, and others that came out of Bridewell, or one jail or another, so that in our poor army we have but few that either fear God or reverence man." 8 Yet several of the officers had sat as judges at the trial of the king and had signed his death warrant, and among both officers and soldiers there was a fair sprinkling of Ironsides. Cromwell's commission to Admiral Penn took the form of an incisive and passionate manifesto, justifying his contemplated attack upon the Spanish possessions in the West Indies as a rightful measure for exacting reparation for past injuries and ensuring security for the future. It fiercely denounced the cruelties and inhuman practices of the King of Spain exercised in America, not only upon the Indians and natives but also upon the people of those nations inhabiting in those parts, whom he had, contrary to the common right and law of nations, by force of arms driven from those places whereof they were the rightful possessors, murdering many of their men, and leading others into captivity, and to this very day doth not only deny to trade, or to have any commerce with us for the people of those countries in any part of America, but, contrary to the treaties between the 2 Six States, doth exercise all acts of hostility against us, and this people there, as against open and professed enemies, giving thereby and by the claim he makes to all that part of the world by the color of the Pope's donation, just grounds to believe that he intends the ruin and destruction of all the English plantations, people and interest in those parts. 9 His peremptory demand that English merchants should be allowed the free exercise of their religion in the Spanish dominions, and that English colonists and traders should no longer be treated as pirates in the West Indies had in fact been currently rejected. To ask for liberty from the Inquisition and free sailing in the West Indies, said the Spanish ambassador, was to ask for his masters to ice, and no concession would be made on either point. Venables was consequently given full liberty of action. The design in general, he was told, is to gain an interest in that part of the West Indies in the possession of the Spaniard. For the effecting whereat we shall not tie you up to a method by any particular instructions. 10 From Hispaniola the baffled English commanders made their way to Jamaica, thinly peopled and weakly garrisoned, where they had better fortune. Inefficient as the land forces were, the conquest of the inhabited part of the island was easily accomplished, with the exception of a considerable portion of the hilly pasture lands on its north side, to which the governor with most of the Spanish planters and their slaves retired, and with the aid of reinforcements from Cuba and Puerto Rico, waged an intermittent but tantalizing and costly guerrilla warfare with the invaders for 5 years before they were finally expelled. From the first, the Spanish court had recognized the distressing prospect that undisputed possession of the island would enable the English to obstruct the commerce of all the islands to the windward with the coasts of the mainland and of New Spain. The fleets and galleons will run great risk in passing 7 Jamaica. 11 Its immediate recovery was seen to be an object of vital importance. In fair weather with a favoring breeze, the passage from Cuba to the northern coast of Jamaica could be made with ease and safety even by small undecked boats. Soldiers and workmen were sent over in small parties, and several small forts were built by them. Bands of Maroons and Negroes were encouraged to harass the invaders, with some success, under the command of a mulatto, Juan Lugalo or Juan de Boas, whose memory is still perpetuated in the name of the river and Savannah. But although they thus succeeded in maintaining a substantial foothold behind the central range of hills, they failed to recover any lost ground. After venting his displeasure upon the unlucky commanders of the expedition for their failure to take Hispaniola, Cromwell decided to retain and colonize their actual conquest and published a proclamation describing Jamaica as spacious in extent, commodious in its harbors and rivers within itself, healthful by its situation, well stored with horses and other cattle, and generally fit and worthy to be planted and improved to the advantage, honor, and interest of this nation. Laws and ordinances for its government were promulgated. Surveyors were appointed to lay out lands for desirable settlers. It announced that all planters and adventurers to that island would be exempted from paying any excise or custom duty on goods and necessaries transported thither for 7 years, and that no customs or other tax or impost would be laid upon any product imported from thence into any other English possession for the next 10 years, dating in each case from the following Michaelmas, and that no embargo would be imposed during that period on any ships or seamen sailing for Jamaica. The struggling colonists of New England, who had begun to despond, were invited to remove themselves or such numbers of them as shall be thought convenient, out of those parts where they now are to Jamaica. 12 Many English people were firmly convinced that Spain was a cruel and implacable national enemy. Cromwell proclaimed this doctrine insistently in his speech to Parliament on 17 September, 1656. Abroad, he said, "Our great enemy is the Spaniard. He is a natural enemy, by reason of that enmity that is in him against whatsoever is of God." No satisfaction could be obtained either for the denial of freedom of conscience to the English traders in Spain or for the blood of our poor people shed in the West Indies. The truth is that no peace is possible with any popish state. Sign what you will with one of them, that peace is but to be kept so long as the Pope says amen to it. The Spaniard hath an interest in your bowels. The Papists in England have been accounted Spaniards ever since I was born. They never regard France, they never regarded any Papist state. Spain was their patron. 13 In his opinion the contest was a just and holy war. He promised liberal supplies to General Fortescue, to whom Venables had turned over the command of the troops. "We think it much designed, and it is much designed amongst us," he assured him, "to strive with the Spaniard for the mastery of all those seas." His mind had been strongly impressed by proposals for an easy conquest of other Spanish provinces in America, laid before him by Thomas Montfort of Barbados and the renegade priest, Thomas Gage. 14 His instructions to Admiral Goodson, Penn's successor, declared that the war must be carried on in the spirit of a crusade. "Set up your banners in the name of Christ," he wrote to him with his wonted fervor, "for undoubtedly it is his cause. And let the reproach and shame that hath been for your sins and the misguidance of some lift up your hearts to confidence in the Lord, and for the redemption of his honor from men who attribute their success to their idols, the work of their own hands. The Lord himself hath a controversy with your enemies. even with that Roman Babylon of which the Spaniard 9 is the great underpropper. In this respect we fight the Lord's battles. 15 He intended to make Jamaica the base for very extensive offensive operations against the Spaniards both by land and sea. These were delayed by frequent unforeseen changes in the command. Fortescue died after holding it only for 3 months. Colonel Edward Boyle was chosen to succeed him by his fellow officers. Major Robert Sedgwick soon after arrived from England to replace Winslow, the Protector's civil commissioner, who had also fallen the victim to disease, and superseded Boyle. The army was much reduced by sickness and desertion. Being warned by letters from England, confirmed by statements of prisoners, that a great armada was under orders to sail from Spain for the West Indies, both Boyle and Sedgwick gave some attention to fortifying the excellent harbour of Tewa, afterwards known as Port Royal. Attacks by parties of fugitive slaves gave them much annoyance and sometimes inflicted serious loss of life. They have, so Sedgwick reported, no moral sense, and do not understand what the laws and customs of civil nations mean. We know not how to capitulate a war treaty with them, but be assured they must either be destroyed or brought in upon some terms or other, or else they will prove a great discouragement to the settling of the country. 16 Fortescue had described the island as a fruitful and pleasant land and a fit receptacle for honest men. Sedgwick had confirmed this report, and on the 4th of January, 1656, he published a proclamation jointly with Admiral Goodson, urging the soldiers to cultivate plots of land which would be allotted for them. Some of the officers opposed this by presenting the petition in the name of their men, advising the entire abandonment of the island. But Goodson kept his squadron of ships actively employed. His cruisers lay in wait for Spanish ships and brought in many prizes. Embarking some soldiers he took Santa Marta and Rio de la Hacha, 2 ports of some importance on the mainland of Veragua. But Sedgwick gave him grudging support in these distant excursions, which he did not fail to condemn as both impolitic and unprofitable. "We are not able," he complained, "to possess any place we attack, and so are in no hope thereby to effect our intention of dispensing anything of the true knowledge of God to the inhabitants. To the Indians and blacks we shall make ourselves appear a cruel, bloody, and ruining people, which will cause them, I fear, to think us worse than the Spaniard." 17 Intercepted letters and the admissions of prisoners soon convinced him that the Negro guerrillas would be reinforced by Spanish soldiers, who could land on the north shore of the island unnoticed and unopposed. "If neither soldiers nor planters do come hither," Boyle gloomily declared in April, 1656, "we cannot long keep the place, the advantages of the enemy being able to poise the difference in numbers." The mortality among officers and soldiers was appalling. Sedgwick's sudden death in June replaced Boyle in command for a few months, until he was again superseded by the arrival of Major General William Braine with 1,000 raw recruits. 18 This did not greatly improve the situation, as Braine reported in the following April. "The soldiers are forced to neglect the strictness of their martial duty by rambling abroad to seek a livelihood, so that if the enemy from Spain should attempt us in this condition, I greatly fear the soldiers would make but a weak resistance. Their spirits have been so dejected for want of necessary food and raiment." But many of the officers seemed resolved through the assistance of God to sell their lives as dearly as they can. 19 Braine died early in September, 1657, leaving a blank commission given him by Cromwell, filled in with the 11 names of Boyle, who was at once obliged to make active exertions to repel an invasion. Small bands of Spanish soldiers had landed from time to time and placed themselves under the orders of Don Cristobal Arnaldo Isasi, who had been given a commission as governor of Jamaica. One company of these men came from Havana, another from San Domingo, and a third from Puerto Rico. They were joined by 2 companies of zealous volunteers formed of refugees from Jamaica at Santiago de Cuba. The whole body did not much exceed 500 of all ranks. Still, it formed a substantial reinforcement to the guerrillas, who had already given so much annoyance. Many years before the Spaniards had opened a bridle path and rough cart track quite across the island at nearly its widest part, connecting Sevilla Nueva Saint Anne's Bay on the northern shore with Puerto de Esquivel Old Harbor on the southern. It wound through dense woods and rocky gorges and was little known and very difficult. Vestiges of it are still pointed out as the Old Spanish Road. Their war parties had generally advanced by it. The steepness of the passes and dangers of ambushes were sufficient to discourage effective pursuit by this route. The only prudent manner of reaching the enemy was by the sea. Major Richard Stevens accordingly embarked, and passing around the eastern end of the island attacked one body of Spaniards at St. Anne's Bay, D'Oyly reported, at the head of a party of stout, well, and willing men, to whom about 60 of our officers joined, volunteers, exceedingly desirous of action. After so long a cessation, on their approach the Spaniards dispersed in a complete panic and hid themselves in the neighboring forest. So finding the vanity of following them in the woods and mountains, we left them, D'Oyly concluded. Many privateers and buccaneers of several nations, who had long haunted the petty island of Tortuga and the adjoining coast of Hispaniola, had gladly availed themselves of the safer harbor and more convenient base of operations at Ceuta, and some of them had been given letters of marque against Spain by Braine or D'Oyly. Isacy, who was vigilant and alert in gathering informed information, reported that in that port there were generally 15 or 20 vessels, some entering, some leaving, with a reserve of 8 ships of war. He added that D'Oyly had held a general muster and review of all his troops in March and found that he had 3,000 foot, many of them boys, and the greater part serving through compulsion. 20 A prisoner taken in a canoe on his way to Cuba told D'Oyly that 300 Spaniards were forming the magazine at Las Corazacoles and fortifying it in the expectation of being reinforced. Leaving 100 men to guard their plantations, he promptly embarked the remainder of the troops under Stevens in a small warship and sailed to attack this party. The ship just coming over from Cuba with soldiers and supplies was driven off before it could reach land, and D'Oyly then disembarked his force in a bay 6 miles further west, as he found no suitable landing place nearer the enemy. Marching through the woods he was attacked from an ambush, but his men being well prepared for this by his orders, fired a single volley in reply and instantly charged, routing their assailants and pursuing them so fiercely that few were able to regain the shelter of their stockade, which was built with grape trees and flankers. Placing the third of his force in reserve, D'Oyly advanced to its assault with the rest. There was a stiff dispute for 3/4 of an hour, until the storming party cut a passage through the palisades with their hatchets, when most of their opponents tried to escape by running out over the rocks and throwing themselves into the bay in spite of the desperate efforts of their officers to rally them, yet made not such haste, D'Oyly wrote, but that they left 120 or thereabouts dead on the place, and many wounded, amongst whom were most of the officers. The Master del Campo, Don Francisco de Francia, by means of a prisoner of ours, whom he kept by him, got quarters, and some others whom we found in the rocks, whom 13 though we had received barbarous usage from them we could not kill in cold blood. 18 prisoners were taken, but according to the Spanish account, D'Oyly had greatly exaggerated the number killed. They lost nearly all their arms and ammunition, as well as the whole of the provisions they had so laboriously collected, including large quantities of dried beef and cassava. Many fugitives were believed to have perished miserably in the woods, and some surrendered in despair in a state of starvation. The English lost only 4 men killed and 10 wounded. The King of Spain, the fares do very much fail in these parts, D'Oyly added exultantly in his official letter, and his trade is almost brought to nothing by the many private men of war of English and French, and ours are still abroad to annoy them. Among the ships thus taken or destroyed were 3 loaded with supplies for the Spaniards in Jamaica. The Spanish government was goaded into making still greater efforts to recover its lost possession. The governors of Havana, Santiago, Puerto Rico, and San Domingo were all instructed to send immediate assistance to Isacy, who clung obstinately to his foothold in the recesses of the hills. The Viceroy of Mexico was given supreme control of these operations. 2 small squadrons of ships were equipped, conveying 950 soldiers with provisions and other supplies, which were safely landed at the mouth of the Rio Nuevo on the northern shore of Jamaica sometime in May, 1658. Isacy had been instructed to make every effort to hold his ground. The number of soldiers actually landed was reported to be only 557 of all ranks, under command of Sargento Mayor Don Alvaro de Rasperu, formed into 31 companies of foot. They began at once to fortify a strong position on a steep, rocky hill overlooking the bay, now known as the cliff, which they called the Camp of the Conception. Isacy joined them with his followers, and there they remained undiscovered and 14 unmolested for 12 days, when some English warships, cruising along the coast, observed 3 strange sail anchored near the land but were prevented by calms and variable winds from attacking them closely. In the night these Spanish ships made their escape unseen, having landed 6 small iron guns for the defense of the camp. When this news reached D'Oyly at Cagua, he lost no time in assembling the council of war, which began a discussion. He wrote, whether it were most advantageous to assault them presently, or let them partake of the distemper and wander the country, and when sickness weakened them to attempt them then, though much might have been and was urged, how invaders were to be used with delays, and see, the exceeding desire of the officers and soldiers to be doing with them cut off all debates and termed the sudden resolution to fall on them before they were fortified. 20 to 750 men were embarked in 6 of the ships in the service of the Commonwealth, which sailed from Cagua on June 11. 11 days later this expedition, commanded by D'Oyly himself, anchored in the little bay of Rio Nuevo, and the soldiers were landed under distant gunfire from the Spanish camp. They were posted near the shore by 2 companies of Spaniards and a band of 15 or 20 Negroes, who defended an advanced post with great obstinacy until a third of them were killed and many others wounded. At the same time the guns of the English ships bombarded the camp with little effect, the place being of so vast a height, they could bear to do them little harm. 23 ladders were made for the escalade of the stockade, which was plainly seen to be of considerable height. On the face nearest them, in the evening the drummer was sent with a summons to the commandant to surrender, assuring him of honorable terms and a safe passage to his own territory, but partly also to sound the depth of the river, which he was obliged to ford. This man was civilly received by Assace himself, who gave him 15 pieces of eight and sent a jar of sweetmeats to D'Oyly with the reply that he was well provided with provisions, ammunition, and brave men that knew how to die before they be overcome. Next morning, after instructing 2 of his ships to move to leeward as a feint to distract the enemy's attention, and all the others to warp inward as close to the shore as possible and keep up a brisk fire upon the enemy's camp, D'Oyly began his march through the tangled woods to get at the other side of the entrenchment. After fording the river higher up, his advance guard surprised the working party occupied in building a breastwork, who ran away crying that all the world was coming. The hill was then climbed with great difficulty on its steepest side, and the storming party discovered with great joy that the rampart had not been built to its full height on that front. "We ordered our business with our forlorn ladders and hand grenades," D'Oyly stated, and without any further dispute received their shot, and ran up to their flankers, which in a quarter of an hour we gained. Many of them made a shift to run out of the works, and ours followed their chase about 3 or 4 miles. The seamen likewise seeing them run along the rocks, came out with their boats, and killed many of them. A battle in those days, as soon as either body took to its heels to escape, almost invariably became the pitiless butchery of the panic-stricken fugitives. D'Oyly reported that about 300 Spaniards were killed, including the Sargento-Mayor, several other officers, and 2 priests. About 100, including 6 captains, were made prisoners. All their cannon, many muskets, a great supply of ammunition and provisions, the King of Spain's standard, and 10 other flags were taken. In the assault 6 English officers and 23 soldiers had been killed and 34 were wounded, some of them mortally. "Thus hath the Lord made known his salvation," D'Oyly devoutly affirmed. His righteousness had so openly showed in the sight of the heathen. 2416 His victory was largely due to his own efficient leadership.